Hi everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to introduce the Global Voice Initiative. I'm Francesco Cecon and I'm the head of the Global Voice Initiative at ECPAT International. I'm very glad to be here with you today and to quickly introduce the work we're doing at ECPAT to make sure that all boys are protected from any form of sexual abuse and sexual exploitation. So the Global Voice Initiative is an initiative launched by ECPAT International a couple of years ago to shed light on the issue, but also to make sure that we understand the different manifestations of sexual violence against boys and look into solutions. So the Global Voice Initiative started as a research project that wanted to really understand and collect data and evidence on how boys are affected by sexual abuse and exploitation, to then transform into something even more practical and forward-looking. The research was important because the research allowed us to gather all the information and evidence that was available at the global level, but also to really delve deeper into understanding how boys are affected by sexual abuse and exploitation in 10 different countries of the world in 5 different regions. The research was groundbreaking because, in spite of being conducted in different contexts, it allowed us to gather common learnings. So we understood that this was really a global issue that required global attention. So boys, in spite of cultural, economic, and societal different dynamics, boys do face the same issues when it comes to seek out help and disclose because of gender norms and ideas of masculinity, but also because service providers are not always necessarily equipped to be able to work with boys. They are not always necessarily equipped to understand how boys are affected by sexual abuse and exploitation. And the gender bias we have affects the way we construct services, we construct child protection systems. So this creates a vicious circle in which boys, even when they're able to seek out help, they might encounter resistance from families, communities, but also those who are in charge of their protection, so such as child protection services, but also other support and care services. The research was also important because it allowed us to consult directly boy survivors themselves and understand what were their experiences and what they would have liked to have as an ideal service when they experienced, unfortunately, sexual abuse and exploitation in their own context. And it was interesting because boys had a very clear idea and picture of what an ideal service looks like. So boys shared with us the importance of active listening, the importance of deconstructing masculinity when looking for help, and the importance of being believed first and foremost. We continued to consult with survivors during different exchanges we had with other global organizations, but also during the documentation of case studies that we conducted with both our ECPAT members, but also with external partners. So following the research we conducted at the Global Voice Initiative, we really wanted to focus on practice. So we understood what the issues were. We understood what the manifestations of sexual exploitation and abuse were, and what were the unique and specific challenges that boys face when accessing protection services. But what we missed was, how do we then work with boys? What are the practices and approaches that seem to work, based also on what the boys themselves shared with us? So at ECPAT, we conduct a series of case studies in 8 countries for now, and we intend to continue conducting more case studies to be able to understand how services had to adjust the way they work with children specifically, and develop specific expertise to address the specific trajectories of boys. So how services had to deconstruct ideas of masculinity, how services had to change the way they talked and communicate to be able to work with boy survivors and provide a service that was accepted by boys and was relevant and just for boys. And it was interesting because there is a lot of expertise on the issue. The problem is that this expertise is somewhat scattered around the globe and not necessarily documented and not known by other organizations. So what we're trying to do now is making sure that we translate all this amazing expertise and all this amazing learning that many civil society organizations developed around the world into knowledge that can be used for more service providers. So how do we translate this learning into practice? The idea that we have an ECPAT and we want to do this in a collaborative way with more stakeholders is to make sure that we capture all this learning and we make sure it's translated into capacity strengthening actions, programmatic tools, training materials, guidelines, and principles that more and more child protection actors, service providers, and any interest stakeholders really can use to adjust their services. So some of the interesting practices we gathered were really around the question of deconstructing masculinity, creating a safe space for boys, and making sure that boys were feeling at ease when sharing and comfortable and felt that they were listened to. So when it comes down to promising practices that we notice, everything really is related to the capacity of frontline workers to be able to create a safe space for boys, a comfort space for boys, when there is no judgment, no discrimination, no stigma, and there is active listening. These all seem very easy to look on paper, but it becomes more difficult to do on practice, and it really comes down also to matter of soft skills of each and individual frontline worker and service provider. So as you can imagine, it is quite hard to translate these soft skills that someone might have into standards, guidelines, principles, and capacity building tools and trainings. But this is the challenge we have, and this is the challenge that we're ready to also face and to achieve it. It is important that moving forward, we try to focus on solution. And I also want to use this opportunity to discuss with you if you have experience and learning on what seem to be promising and interesting practices to work with boys. So far, what we were able to identify is that frontline workers, when working with boys, really need to make an effort to challenge their own gender biases and to actively listen to boys. Challenging their own gender biases mean that those norms, those gender norms, and those ideas of masculinities that look at boys as stoic, as strong, and manly, as barriers that prevent them from seeking out help. And those biases are not only integrated um, in the way of functioning of boys, but also in the way that we function, in the way as service providers we function. And sometimes those can be reflected in the way we communicate and work with boys. So service providers understood that they needed to do a lot of work on themselves first to be able to deconstruct those gender norms and those ideas of masculinity, to then be able to not reflect them on boys when communicating with boys, when trying to support boys. And this comes down really to being able to create a safe space in this sense. So some of the key tips that service providers shared with us in terms of practice were really constructed around this. We're really constructed around communicating in a language that is not judgmental, that is safe, that is not stigmatizing, and confidential. So service providers really notice the importance of making sure that when discussing with boys, confidentiality is stressed, but also that there is a non-judgmental space that boys can share and feel safe in sharing whatever they feel about their expertise, but without necessarily looking for too much information. One thing that was really interesting to me when listening to service providers was that they shared that in working with boys, reaching a point of disclosure is not necessarily the ultimate goal. What we want to be able to work with boys is how to provide protection, support, and emotional recovery, but without necessarily having all the details about what happened or without putting boys in a situation where they need to be re-victimized. So these are just some of the few like tips that they shared, but there is more, and I encourage you to share and read the case studies that we developed that are available on our website to understand more. But let's say that we use this practice as well and this learning to convene the first ECPAT Global Boys Summit, which happened in June 2023 in Casablanca, in Morocco, and was organized with our member in Morocco, Aman. We organized the Global Boys Summit in the format of a workshop in which we wanted to retake these tips, approaches, and learnings that I just shared quickly with you, delve deeper into this, and identify together what solutions do we have, what needs to be scaled up, what needs to be learned, and what needs to be developed more. So the Global Boys Summit gathered 65 people from civil society organizations at the global, at international level, practitioners, experts, academia, global agencies, and donor communities to really delve deeper into these practices, delve deeper into the specific challenges that boys face when it comes to issues of sexual abuse and exploitation, but also into solutions. So the Global Boys Summit in June 2023 was incredibly groundbreaking because it was the first time ever that these people could come together, could discuss in a safe space what were the challenges they were facing, but also identify together what is it that needed to be done, what is it that we need as a global community moving forward. As you all know, when we work on questions of sexual violence against men and boys, it can get quite lonely. So it is difficult to identify allies across countries, like-minded organizations. So it was really interesting and really motivating to see all these people come together for the first time and see that we were not alone, that we could join forces. And actually, joining forces is the only way forward if we want to start working on solutions, if we want to make sure that more resources, more funding, more attention is dedicated to boys at the global level, and therefore start working on ways to develop solutions for boys. And it was also a self-care moment, I think, for everyone to see how supportive this was. And it was also an important moment to clarify how working on these issues is an opportunity to challenge harmful gender norms, to challenge harmful ideas of masculinity that do not only affect boys, but in turn also create violence in communities and contribute to issues of gender-based violence. The Global Boys Summit was an important moment to also for practitioners and academia and civil society to come together and think, are we communicating about this in the right way? There is sometimes a misunderstanding about what we're trying to do. And the Global Boys Summit was a moment to clarify, working on ensuring that all boys are protected against sexual abuse and exploitation is not only an obligation, again, under human rights and children's rights to make sure that all boys are protected, but it's also an opportunity to make sure that we can reduce levels of gender-based violence. What we saw from research and practice was that when working with boys, when working with communities on ideas of masculinity, gender norms, gender roles and relations, we can actually transform them and we can make sure that all children are protected from any form of sexual violence. So finally, to conclude, what I want to say as well is that after the Global Boys Summit, we have a clear roadmap on what needs to be done. I'm happy to share with you the outcome report of the Global Boys Summit, but also I'm happy to answer any questions or comments you may have on the way forward. But just to quickly share the main highlights. The Global Boys Summit really was a moment in which practitioners were able to say, we need to do this together, we need to join forces. And then this means that we need to clearly identify together what are the strategic opportunities, moments that exist at the global and regional level to influence change. What are the spaces that we need to influence? What are the opportunities? What are the actors? What are the decision makers that we need to involve to be able to change something about this? So these are all questions that we are going to answer together as a global community moving forward. And the decision of the Global Boys Summit was to do this identification process together, but also to build on the different resources and capacity of every supporting organizations to really maximize these opportunities that we will identify. And same goes for programming. So one thing that came out of the summit was that we know what ideal service provision looks like. Ideal service provision looks like a place where all service providers that are involved in the provision of protection to boys, meaning child protection staff, meaning law enforcement staff, meaning healthcare supporters, and so on, need to have the necessary skills to create a safe space with boys that is not judgmental, that is confidential, and that makes sure that boys can recover safely. So this means that we can translate all this knowledge that practitioners have into concrete training packages, tools, and principles for other child protection actors to be able to work with boys. And this is another outcome of the Global Boys Summit. And how we're going to achieve this, the idea is to do it again together. So we're really interested into looking into practice and experiences that are happening at the local level already that can be documented and be translated for tools at the global level and be replicated in more countries. So one of the outcomes of the Global Boys Summit is to identify more and more of these practices and putting them together into tools that can be useful for more practitioners. So it's a long-term process, as you can understand and can imagine, but it's the right way forward. We need to be able to create a safe space first, even before continuing to raise awareness, so that more boys can make sure that more boys can be sure that they can access safe spaces. The way we're going to do it is, again, is to collaborate and make sure that we have a compilation of all the practice available, of all the tools available, and try to create something at the global level that can be replicated. Moving forward, again, another big highlight of the Global Boys Summit is the need to campaign around the issue, to be more vocal about the issue, and to do so with the right language. Again, with a language that makes sure that this is understood as an issue that is relevant at the global level, that all countries are affected by this, but also that can be a powerful tool to contribute to the broader fight against gender-based violence. I'm going to stop here because I think I'm already over time, but I'm happy to answer any questions, comments during the session, but also following the session and to engage more on this. Thank you so much for your attention and time.
Right now, we are losing our boys to violence, to gangs, to suicide. We need targeted interventions. We need research. We need data. We need to get all stakeholders involved on this topic.
In June 2023, the first ever ECPAT Global Boys Summit in Casablanca, Morocco, brought together 65 practitioners from over 30 countries, united to amplify support for boys at risk and survivors of sexual exploitation and abuse, paving the way for a safer future.
The Global Boys Summit is important because it brings together practitioners. That's something we've been missing for quite a while because that's where the bottleneck is situated. And we know that there's some pioneer organizations that have done brilliant work in learning, oftentimes by doing, but really engaging with children, with boys.
The summit created a space for like-minded individuals to connect on a personal level, expanding the global community committed to protecting and empowering boys. Workshops and group discussions ignited meaningful conversations on how to break down gender norms and ideas of masculinity, and how to build safe environments while working with boy survivors.
And this has been the first time that we've all been able to connect. And just as adolescent boy survivors need a community, we all need a community of support.
We need interventions where silence has to be broken within the boy child. And this can be done through a sense of psychosocial support. Interventions are needed for our boys and a sense of safe space for our boys.
At the World Cafe, practitioners took center stage to showcase their innovative practices, tools, and resources developed to meet the unique needs of boys from diverse contexts and communities. Uniting their collective experience and expertise, practitioners transformed these learnings into tangible solutions, developing action points to be implemented at the global level. The 2023 Global Boys Summit has kickstarted a worldwide movement to supercharge support for boy survivors and arm practitioners with the best tools for appropriate and quality care. Protection is everyone's responsibility. Let's end the sexual exploitation and abuse of boys.
I'd like to invite Nathan, Francesco, and Perry to join me for our panel discussion. Perfect. So our questions for today. So I will start with the first one. What are some trauma-informed, culturally sensitive approaches to engage diverse communities in conversation about human trafficking, child sexual abuse, violence, masculinity, healing? while acknowledging the unique social contexts?
Just very quickly, I think one clear information piece that came out of the series of case studies we conducted in different countries was that when our different organizations work with boys on these questions and with communities on these questions from marginalized communities or from communities that were different. We can think about migrant or refugees or displaced people or minorities in country. I think one big lesson learned that was common across countries was the fact of taking the time to understand that and using the right language. So every organization had to take a step back and understand and research on how do we talk about gender, how do we talk about gender roles and issues of masculinities in a community specifically. What is the language that we use, that boys use, but that communities themselves use as well, families, that is accepted. And we know that the construction of masculinity is so important it's such a big obstacle in the capacity to seek out help and look for help, that we need to understand what is the pressure that boys feel to comply with that role before being able to address this. So I think, for services or for organizations working on these questions, at least, I think it's very important to conduct at least, I don't want to use the word research, but at least some assessment of what are the cultural dynamics within the specific community, collaborating with that community before being able to even address the topic.
Thank you so much, Francesco. And I have definitely learned that through the research itself, interviewing different nationalities, different ethnic groups, and you can definitely see that there are very different barriers that come up depending on what ethnicity that you come from. And instead of just going forward and disclosing, some communities have that sense of bringing dishonor to the whole community or to the family, and that alone can stop them from disclosing. And it's very important to understand those sub barriers as well, just in those different communities, so we can create those safe spaces they don't just fit that one box, but really expand to anyone that really goes forward for help, or just to understand those that don't come forward to get help. Thank you very much. So let's go to our next question, and it's, what do you suggest to men and boys that are seeking help? And Francesco, is there anything that you would like to add to that?
I'm not in a position to give any guidance to boys on how to disclose and how to look for help. I think rather what I would encourage us as a community and practitioners and service providers is to challenge our own gender biases that are so baked in the way we function. And, especially to those child protection services, to question ourselves on how do we see boys as potential survivors of sexual abuse and sexual exploitation, and to be able to be a supportive ear and to be someone who's in a position to believe what the boys are telling us, even if they're not telling it directly. And I think also what many practitioners have shared with me during the series of case studies was, you don't need full disclosure to be able to support someone. So if we know that disclosure is not possible for whatsoever reason, mostly being shame or guilt or safety as well, we can still be able to support and provide support, emotional help at least. So my invitation is more to service providers rather than to boys.
No, thank you so much. And of course, we have to look at it that way as well, to make sure that we're looking at the situation in a more holistic manner. And when I was doing my research, I was able to get 40 male survivors to tell me what was helpful to them and what wasn't helpful to them in the master's thesis. And it was very interesting because they actually made kind of like a progression chart of, the very first thing was admitting that something had happened, and really kind of going through that, their own self-research, starting to really ask those questions to themselves and looking for more information. And then that's when the next step, which Perry had mentioned, it was just find one person to open up to trust, to speak to, and then that can lead to community. And then that can lead to then actively getting help, going to someone that is trauma informed, that is specialized in the type of trauma that you need. And then furthermore, going after things that bring you joy again and bring you that happiness so that you can kind of start going into that thriving and not so much into just surviving. And so if anyone was interested in looking at that, Michelle has it in one of the handouts. It's the master's thesis, and that was created by survivors for survivors. But that leads me into the last question, which is, can you tell us about any toolkit items, books, programs, or initiatives that you would like to highlight? And Francesco, is there anything that the Global Voice Initiative or ECPAT are doing that are coming up in the future?
Well, I mean, on our website, you have the research, the case studies, and the reports as well of the Global Voice Summit, which we showed a video of. And in the future, we're going to focus mostly on collaboration and bringing forward the action points of the Global Voice Summit. So I look forward to connect it to, and with anyone who's interested and wants to work on this.
And thank you so much, Francesco, for that. And it is actually quite incredible that you were able to bring together so many practitioners from around the world. And it was amazing to see that those documents have just come out a couple of days ago of the findings from those. And you can find those as well in the handout, everyone.